Okay, so I think we should be live on YouTube now. So hi everyone, and thanks for joining us for this lunchtime meetup hosted by the Environment and Behaviour Hub at the UCL Centre for Behaviour Change. I'm Jo Hale and I convene the Hub, and I'd like to welcome you all, whether you're on the call today or watching the live stream. So this is the first of our online meetups, and the live stream part will involve a short guest talk and Q&A. And then after we finish the live stream, there'll be a chance for Hub members who are on the call with us to carry on talking informally, do a bit of networking. So today we're going to be talking plastic waste, and I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker, Danielle Purkiss. Danielle's a research fellow at UCL, where she's a member of the Plastic Waste Innovation Hub, and her projects have included the nationwide Big Compost Experiment and many others. So please feel free to post your comments and questions for Danielle during her talk, and then we'll do all the Q&A at the end. So I think that's it from me. Thanks very much for joining us, Danielle, and over to you for your talk.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction. Hi everyone, thanks for joining. So my name's Danielle and I'm part of this group at UCL called the UCL Plastic Waste Hub. And basically it's an assembled group of individuals and departmental expertise from across UCL, taking really an interdisciplinary approach to the issues around plastic waste and environment. And so I'm sort of representing a kind of design arm of the Plastic Waste Hub, and I have a background in architecture. But I'm also working with people who are also here in the webinar. Aisha is around as well, around the subject of behaviour change. But we also work with a whole range of other people supporting this multidisciplinary view of circular economy, design and waste. So things like policy, chemistry, finance, material flow, and so on. So really kind of an interesting group to start off with, and that sort of sets the context of who we are and how we're tackling issues around plastic waste. So I just wanted to first sort of bring everyone's focus today to packaging, and it's a very interesting and hot topic, and I think possibly the fact that I've chosen a box of tea bags, it's also sort of a very relevant everyday issue, I think, that we can all sort of think about a little bit more. So I just wanted to introduce the idea of what the role of packaging is, and it's a kind of an interesting one and quite a hard one to define. And it's something that's often very much overlooked in our everyday lives, but we know fundamentally how important it is and what the issues are with packaging when things start to go slightly wrong, where packaging is out of place and it causes things like pollution, environmental pollution, also overuse of packaging, increasing things like emissions in terms of the production of the packaging itself. But sort of focusing this idea of packaging and its role and its relationship with behaviour, I think it's just important to sort of really look at the complexity of what a piece of packaging is doing. And this is just an unfolded view of a PG Tips box. And you can see already just looking over some of the language, the imagery, the colour, it's an incredible feat of design. And just imagining when you're walking around a shop or if you're shopping online, packaging is just such a dense and complicated network of systems and frameworks, and some of it is legal, some of it has regulatory a framework around it, some of it is more about behaviour and emotion, and some of it is very much tied in with our kind of cultural belief, our cultural understanding. So it's incredibly complex. It's also quite difficult to sort of separate sometimes the packaging, the container, from the product, and it's sort of a sliding scale. So I've only just shown a box and the tea that the box contains here, but thinking about how packaging itself, where it sits, how it sits in our everyday lives, in the physical fabric of our homes or in shops or supermarkets, packaging actually also shapes those physical environments as well. It's also something that's incredibly powerful, and it affects our own kind of cognitive understanding of the world. So there's very much a very strong behavioural and emotional role that packaging plays in our lives. It's quite symbiotic. It's quite difficult to unpick what causes the other in a sort of chicken and egg scenario. So our world views, our kind of behavior in effect is shaped by much of the information that appears on packaging. We also affect how packaging is made because of our consumer citizen choices. So when we're shopping, our attitudes and our desires actually sort of express themselves through the way we buy things. Such as a bit of a sort of romp through how packaging itself is incredibly complicated and has this very almost intrinsic behavioral link. So I'm just going to introduce you now to the project which we introduced at the beginning. It's called the Big Compost Experiment. And so really just sort of take you through the sort of preambles of why we started this experiment in 2019. And really we were realizing as researchers looking at plastic waste in general and the role of packaging in plastic waste, that there is this huge shift happening generated by a few initiatives and a lots of media coverage around the plastic waste problem and the pollution and the environmental impact it's causing. So really what we've seen in the last few years as researchers is a very interesting evolution and a response from manufacturers and industry responding to these issues of we don't want to buy packaging as citizens that creates environmental problems. And so there's this kind of interesting sort of evolution there of pressure on manufacturers, both from the citizen point of view, but also from initiatives around sort of government regulation and initiatives to try and reduce pollution. We've got this kind of squeeze happening, and lots of manufacturers are deciding to just switch their material packaging production to compostables. And a compostable plastic is essentially a plastic that's designed and engineered very specifically to break down under a particular condition, which is conditions that you might likely find in a composter at home or in industrial composting processes, which happen through council collection and happens UK-wide. But so what from this small selection of items that our participants from this Big Compost Experiment submitted, we can see there's a sort of startling range of language and imagery and other kinds of coding, which is essentially giving lots of direction, sometimes conflicting, sometimes information which is applicable to the material itself. And some of it actually really ties into asking a consumer or a citizen to behave in a particular way. So things like compostable or pop me in your compost bin or fully degradable, they're quite leading terms. And so it's sort of a complexity we're starting to see with the language around it. So really why, just sort of zooming out for a second to understand the current state of play for the compostable plastics packaging sector in the UK. Really currently we have a problem that it doesn't work on many levels and in many parts of this circular system. So at the moment, most compostable plastics can be made from biomass. They're engineered to become biodegradable polymers. These polymers are then designed to become the pieces of packaging that we interact with when we're shopping, we see advertising for. And then we have a point there where a citizen and the behaviour of a citizen becomes such an important part of the future route of this material. And it really all starts to fall down at the moment when it comes to identifying and understanding what is a compostable plastic and what is not a compostable plastic. So showing the difference and differentiating between them, but then also knowing what is the target disposal route, where do we want these things to go in order for them to not have an impact on the environment, and to fulfill what they're designed to do, so in order to compost. And unfortunately, at the moment, there are lots of other things, not just the sort of issue around identification, which are causing issues. There's things behind the scenes, so where the waste goes, where it's processed for either recycling or composting or incineration or landfill. There are issues around identifying it on a kind of technological level there as well. So these things they're slipping through, and at the moment their ultimate destination is really landfill and incineration right now. So part of our plastic waste hub research is really, we're starting to identify these key areas, these hotspots of this life cycle of this material, and understanding what are the things that really need to change, that really need further research in order to try and improve the system and make sure that the system becomes circular again. So money is a big one. So some of the regulatory and fiscal policies that support waste collection, waste processing, that's not really happening for compostables yet, although this is under review, and over the next 2 years, we should see some developments in terms of extended producer responsibility and the way that waste infrastructure is funded in this country. We also identified that we really do need to start to think about the kind of the sort of physical, chemical, behavioural side of the materials when they're composted. So actually trying to make sure that we optimise and make those composting processes very efficient. Those materials will work well in those processes. But then the really key, sort of zooming back into this kind of point of focus on behaviour and citizens, this idea of identifying the material is so crucial in order for people to actually play a part in this cycle. And then knowing where to dispose of it properly, that's a sort of another key question. So just to sort of give you a kind of whistle stop tour of the compostable plastics world, roughly there are two categories of compostable plastics designed currently in the world. One is a home compostable plastic, so a plastic you might recognise by the name, it's designed to technically break down and compost under a home composting condition. The other is industrially compostable plastics, where they're designed to break down under specific conditions of industrial composting processes. So they might be open windrow, which is a kind of open compost heap, in-vessel composting, which is composting in a controlled, much more regulated environment, or anaerobic digestion, which is a slightly different environment. Again, it's a biodegradation process, but without oxygen. So it's a slightly different thing, and you get different results and different products coming out at the end. So roughly there are two categories there. So our big compost experiment, we developed it and launched it in 2019. And really it was to try and gather some original data on this area of that life cycle, which was around the citizen opinion and behaviour and awareness of these materials. So does someone know what a compostable plastic is and how to dispose of it? But also is to get some quantitative data on how these kinds of materials were actually performing and are currently performing in home composters. And this is a sort of very understudied area of this whole life cycle of this material. So really, it was quite an exciting thing to start to try and gather this information in. So we've had a great feedback from the public, and our citizen scientists are still ongoing. They're still uploading. It's part of my week is enjoying going through everyone's compost bin photos and seeing what they've been popping in there. So I'm kind of enjoying that side of the whole survey and study. But this is roughly how you take part. So the methodology is really signing up online, taking a survey, giving us some information about your kind of opinion and awareness of these materials. And then the second part is to have a go at popping some compostable plastics into your compost bin at home, and then just telling us how it works out, what happens to it when you finish composting, and whether or not it's successfully broken down and composted in those time frames. So this is just the sort of scale that people were comparing their item results to. And this will make sense when I just show you a couple of our graphs later on. So really from scale 0 on our scale, which is where an item has gone through a composting process and it appears pretty much intact. There's no kind of evidence there of this thing breaking down, all the way over to scale 3 and scale 4, where you're seeing kind of more of a kind of extreme degradation process. It's broken up into much smaller pieces, or it's completely gone in your composter. So through the study, people taking part were able to submit lots of kind of fields of information, and one of them was, we just simply asked, what do you compost and what do you use? And it was really amazing to see what a cool and interesting range of approaches to composting. So firstly, we understand now that composting is a very varied process, and with that there's a sort of variety of practices and behaviors around the actual process of composting, but this ultimately creates a range of environments, which means that the plastics, when they're put in this range of environments, they're behaving in a whole range of ways. And so this is kind of useful for us to know, because it means that actually some of the ways in which people are thinking about designing compostable plastics, perhaps it's not sufficient in order to cope with or break down properly within this range of processes. So roughly categorizing what are the influences that affect home compostable plastics, the disposal, but also the actual performance of them in a composter. So on the left, we've really got the sort of more behavioral stuff, and on the right, we've got the stuff that's really related to the environment that the material is in. So you can see that perception, identification, and your kind of attitudes toward disposal, they're a key factor in how compostable plastics work at home, but also your composting method and time frame. So we've got people who do some very different things, very intricate methods of doing this, and it all produces a range of environments and a range of timescales for these things to break down in. So what we're now just over a year now, and we've already got around 500 data points. So actual in real life results from these experiments. We're amassing just an amazing range of bits of broken stuff, or all kinds of things popping out in a range of conditions. And it's really fascinating to see. What we're fundamentally finding, though, is even after only 12 months, that there is a considerable issue around these materials as they're currently designed, and they're not breaking down in composting timeframes. So really people are getting kind of annoyed, actually. So some of the feedback that we've had from citizens is that they're actually fairly, I mean, to quote a few, they're sort of disgusted with finding this material still there lingering around. And some people have actually decided, in some instances, to withdraw from the experiment because they just found it so unpalatable, and they didn't want to have to deal with that in their gardening. That yeah, so it is having a really kind of interesting effect on people seeing this and seeing it all together. I think this is the power of citizen science and having it online for kind of open public views. That a lot of people are seeing this result and sharing these results with others, and yeah, realizing there's a bigger impact potentially from these materials. So just to sort of whistle stop through some of the kind of high level bits of data. This is a sort of a roundup of where we're at. So we had about 402 item results just before Christmas. Everything in red is an item that has disappeared basically within someone's composting timeframes, and everything else is a result where the item has remained, so parts of it or the whole thing has remained intact in someone's composter. So in fact, there's a huge percentage of these materials and these items still remaining. So we can see there's an issue there currently. And here's the question which we had as part of our survey, basically to try and understand in a bit more nuanced detail, were people likely to buy products with compostable and packaging, compostable and biodegradable markings on the packaging, and why? And I think Aisha might be able to talk a little bit more about this after this talk, but yeah, so there's some interesting reasons, and an overwhelming 84% saying yes, we are. So we kind of wanted to know a little bit more why people are interested in buying these materials. What's the motivation behind it? And then seeing quite a large percentage of people at the moment in the current infrastructure in the UK currently disposing of these materials using home composting, but also people starting to use council food waste collection or organics collections to dispose of these things as well. So we're starting to see that these materials are starting to trickle through into other waste streams now. And that's where, coming back to the kind of whole systems analysis of this, why it's so important to understand what are the issues around this material starting to end up in potentially in council food waste collection and going through those composting processes, or in the worst case scenario, if these materials start ending up in recycling processes, what's happening then to the recycler? Are there problems with people kind of sifting out this as contamination in those processes? So this is a really useful bit of information. And then this was just a sort of a quick look at what we were seeing people submitting for the study, and it really started to sort of show us kind of an interesting set of issues around identification of these materials. So not only, as I showed in the first image of all the compostable plastics photos, that there's a range of information on those items at present, and manufacturers are using a whole range of plain speak language, but also some sort of more regulated symbols and certification symbols on those products. There are some of the materials which have no kind of I guess no regulatory evidence on them either, and they have kind of words like compostable, but there's no backing for that. There's no auditing of that material performance. So this is kind of amazing to see that suddenly we have a real problem here, that if people are going to be such a significant part of this material being processed and actually to ultimately end up in the destination where it needs to end up to compost, then we need to sort out a few fundamentals to do with it. Can we improve how you identify these materials? And also, can we give clear instructions about what you have to do with them? So at the moment, it's really not clear enough. So this is just a sort of summary of where the Plastic Waste Hub work is heading now. Now we've got a new 3-year NERC grant to do some work, which is basically drilling into these issues of this cycle of this material. And we're doing it in a multifaceted way. So we're going to be looking at things like behaviour in relationship to design, packaging, design and labelling. We're going to be looking at some of the technological issues around identification and sorting in some of these waste stream processes. We're also going to be looking at the sort of chemistry and the biochemistry around composting itself and composting of these materials to see whether or not there's a sort of impact on the composting process, or whether there are certain materials which are better suited for those types of processing. So this is, quite an exciting point, but we can answer any questions about that afterwards. So just in summary, I just wanted to kind of round up and ask the question, really, to kick things off. How can labelling design change citizen behaviour? And how can this help reduce waste? So hopefully we can have a few questions around that now as well.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Danielle, for a really interesting, fantastic talk. I know we've got a few questions come in from the live stream on YouTube and in the chat on our call. So I'll hand over to Aisha, who's also a member of the Plastic Waste Innovation Hub, to kind of lead the Q&A. I think it might be nice if we go on perhaps till kind of 12:35 with Q&A on the live stream, just to make sure we get through things. In case anyone needs to leave before then, you can catch up afterwards on answers, and hopefully we'll cover everything. And then we'll move to private chat afterwards, if that sounds okay. Over to you, Aisha.
Danielle, thank you so much. That was great. I love hearing you talk about this project, and I absolutely love working on it as well. So I think we'll just go through some of the questions that came up in the chat. So something that did come up again, and this was something that came through our analyses as well, is that these plastics just they're not composting in the way that we're led to believe based on what's on the packaging, and this is leading to skepticism over biodegradation claims, and it's causing a lot of issues. Something else that came up as well, more related to, and I think we'll start with this question: how did you find the citizen science participants? So how and why did you settle on this method, and how did you go about recruiting these people?
Well, they've been amazing, actually. So I, to sort of give it context, I interact with citizens, like any of the citizen scientists, pretty much every day on a daily basis. I get emails here and there, and it's a very curious thing. I think people are very engaged and enthused and have a lot of energy to try and tackle environmental issues. And I think particularly at the moment, I mean, I suppose at the moment, actually, in fact, COVID is taking over a little bit, but I think that the sort of issue of plastic pollution is always there in the background at the moment and has been for quite some time. And people are very, I suppose, yeah, very, very engaged with it. And they want to help. And I think that there's this kind of interesting dichotomy with participating in citizen science, where it's, you have, I guess, a sort of range of your questions that you're throwing out to people, and you're really kind of hoping that people will engage with it. And I'm finding that people are engaging in it in a many-leveled way, actually. So people who are just sort of participating kind of on one level and shooting back some results, but other citizens are actually sort of very interested in sharing their experiences in a more detailed way. And I guess that's the value of using citizen science approach in this case. It's actually understanding the nuance that you don't get from the kind of quantitative data. You're actually getting a lot of feedback, which is, I guess, it's just as useful in lots of ways. It's understanding how people are reacting and their views are evolving real time when they're seeing evidence that they've created of this process, and potentially this process not working in the way that they believed it would. So it's just, yeah, it's really sort of fascinating way of studying this particular issue.
Thanks. Danielle, also brilliant way to collect all this data. In terms of recruiting, because when we look at that map, participants seem to be scattered all over the UK. So what sort of recruitment methods were used to get? I mean, I'm guessing the sort of the interaction that you got from these citizens was maybe more than you'd anticipated at the start. Like, how did you recruit people from all over the UK?
So we've used quite a lot of different channels, so media channels, so things like BBC Radio, Gardener's World. We've also been going through other educational institutions. So we did a talk with Brownies, and we did a talk with various schools as well. So we're sort of, I guess, trying to approach it in as broad a way as possible. And like our participation range is from 18, or kids that can recruit their own parents to help them take part. So we have a whole range of people who are actually taking part in it. Yeah, I think that was probably the one thing that we were very aware of, though, is just sort of starting out, is but potentially there's a sort of demographic there of people who are engaging with home composting, and that's largely down to also where you live and your access to outdoor space. So there is a sort of particular demographic that are able to kind of participate this in the main, because it's about home composting in a way. But we've actually starting to have more different institutions, schools, for instance, who are starting to take part as a school, or different kind of youth groups and things that are combining together to take part in their own way. So there's a kind of quite a range. We're starting to see a better range now as we go along.
And I also think that's great, Danielle. Thank you. And also, Raj, your question about the socio-demographic characteristics of the participant group. I think Danielle kind of talked about that there. So as part of this, for ethics purposes, we didn't actually collect information on demographics. Isn't that right, Danielle? So we didn't actually, but obviously, given that this is the compost experiment and the methods that we used to recruit, there is, it's likely that the sort of people who took part were interested in composting to begin with. So, sorry, Joe, I just noticed, oh, no, never mind. Sorry, put something else into the group. So I think so just going back to some of the questions, I think my understanding from Andy's question from YouTube, are there international comparisons that we can learn from? My understanding from this is, are there other similar experiments being conducted by other people? And so Danielle, are there other similar projects?
So far we know that there was, back in time, there was a study done by a UK organisation called Garden Organics, and they carried out a much smaller scale study, but in principle it was very similar, that they were testing how materials degraded and which materials degraded under what timeframes in composters. So that was really more about the material performance. It didn't really have a behavioral arm to it, in terms of they didn't ask questions to do with how are you more likely to buy this stuff or not, kind of thing. Currently, actually, in other countries, so in New Zealand, there's a similar study being carried out by Waste Mins or Waste New Zealand, and they're taking a similar approach, that they're noticing a huge shift in the use of these materials, and they're seeing a lot more of them coming through, and sometimes actually coming through the inappropriate waste streams. So they decided to collate a sort of similar study to understand how things were working in home composters in New Zealand, which again is a sort of, I guess, in its own way, slightly different set of circumstances and culture and climate. But yeah, I think that study is underway, or currently they're doing the analysis on it. So we haven't got a kind of comparison from them yet.
Brilliant, thank you. And also, I think we probably have time for one more. And this is from Charlie on YouTube. Can these materials be composted by council waste collection? Because Charlie's local council has to remove these, as there's no way to separate it from non-compostable items. And this seems to be a huge barrier. So discuss.
Yeah, so currently, back to the kind of first slide that I showed of that system, the point where if you're disposing of this material through council food waste, it's getting as far as the kind of front gates of the composting site. And then they're doing this process where they have to sieve out contaminants. And at the moment, those processes, either they're very human processes where someone just eyeballing a pile of stuff and picking out bags, or there's a sort of slightly more sophisticated process of using things like infrared technology to actually scan things. But they're basically trying to sort out contaminants such as non-recyclable plastics or metals or glass from that process. At the moment, there's no technology that's really working commercially to identify a piece of compostable plastic from a non-compostable version of it. So really there's a sort of point there where everything is getting screened out. Anything that doesn't look like something that should be going through their organic waste processes, they're screening it out, and then that's getting sent to landfill and incineration. So that's really a infrastructure issue, and it's not insurmountable, which is why we're doing this work currently, to try and figure out what are the best technologies out there, what would be commercially viable for a company to use as part of that process. So I think, technically, these materials can work in those systems if they get there, and they're not currently. What was the second part of the question, Aisha? Remind me.
So I just think it boils down to Charlie's kind of making the observation that it's a real barrier, that not so different councils will have different rules and regulations. So for example, saying my local council has to remove these as there's no way to separate it. And this is something that came through a lot of the responses, the surveys that we did by the Big Compost Experiment. Many people were saying, people who did compost these sorts of plastics said that they were able to because they, their environment permitted them to, whereas other people, they were saying that their councils don't offer these sorts of, waste collection services. So again, I just think it boils down to because we don't have this nationwide system of collecting and processing these sorts of plastics.
Yeah. So in that respect, I think that we're at a point where the policy and the infrastructure around these items is also in flux, which makes it quite hard to sort of pin down what's wrong and what should change. So everything is continuously evolving, and over the next 3 years, because of the Environment Bill and new mandates around household food waste collection, every household should have access to a council food waste collection by 2023, and that's quite soon. And so if suddenly there's this kind of route out of the home for these materials, I think there's still not enough understanding yet of what is the potential impact. So if we can kind of simulate and think forward about those things, what kind of issues are going to be presented if a lot more of these packaging choices start flowing through that food waste collection method. And I guess this is a sort of thing of trying to think about these things in advance and simulate them and do the research now, in order that we don't start creating bigger problems later on when you have this influx of material and no way of actually processing it properly. Yeah, I think the other side to sort of the application of these materials, I think that's quite a big topic, and thinking about where these compostable materials should be used, not where they can be used. At the moment, I think it's a bit of a free-for-all. People are using them just, I mean, in quite a cynical way, trying to sell products and selling an idea of how they will function. But I think the question, the sort of sense check, which is where should these materials be used and what applications to, in fact, get the greatest benefit, to whether it's an environmental benefit, commercial cost benefit, or other. And I think that's also something that is in flux at the moment. Lots of industry stakeholders have slightly different views about what we should be using them for. And I think the top 2 or 3 items which seem to be repeated are tea bags, our friend the tea bag, because it contains tea leaves, and inherently it's a piece of containment packaging which has got organic waste in it, which is the tea leaves. So how can we get most of these things, the majority of it, back to a composting process to make something valuable from it? The other one is things like fruit labels, because they're a real, they're so small, and they're kind of an issue because they're stuck on lots of pieces of fruit skin and things, and they get disposed of, and they're so small that it's difficult to sieve them out from the composting process. So they probably should be compostable to avoid the issue of microplastics in the whole system. And then the other is sort of the kind of caddy liners, so like a mechanism, the actual sort of container for transporting food waste to composting processes. There are lots of arguments why caddy liners should be compostable and why they're needed to increase food waste collection in the future. So we sort of have an interesting issue of like where the application of these is best, this compostable material, and then also what infrastructure does that fit in? So we've sort of got 2 sides of it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Danielle. I'm just sorry, I could talk about this forever, but I'm just conscious of time. So I think that we're going to wrap up the live stream here then. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone viewing on YouTube as well. Thank you. And I think we're probably going to move on to private discussion now. So thank you.
Yeah, I just want to add my thanks as well. Thanks so much, Danielle, and thanks to everyone who's commented and asked questions, and we'll continue the discussion.